The universe had always been a place of calm for those who were in power. The Kylaxians, a ruthless and brutal species, were known across the galaxy for their sheer strength and ability to conquer any world they set their eyes on. For centuries, they had obliterated civilizations, leaving nothing behind but devastation and fear. To them, it was simply another day in the galaxy, another world to conquer. They were the hunters, and the rest of the galaxy were their prey. It was no different when they set their sights on the human colony, Iridium 9. Nestled on the edge of human-controlled space, the colony had been established as a peaceful settlement. The people of Iridium 9 had been living their lives, unaware of the looming threat. But that all changed when the Kylaxian warships appeared in the sky. No warning, no mercy, just destruction. The attack was swift, brutal, and absolute. The inhabitants of Iridium 9 were no match for the Kylaxian fleet. The defense systems were outgunned, and the human forces stationed there were not equipped for a battle of this scale. It was over before it had even begun. The colony's last desperate plea for help went out to the human high command, but they feared it would be too late. The Kylaxians had never shown any hesitation before, and they weren't about to start now. Yet there was something humanity had never revealed, something the Kylaxians were completely unaware of. Hidden away in the deepest, most secretive corners of human space, a force had been quietly assembling. These weren't just ordinary soldiers, nor were they regular humans who lived peaceful lives in colonies. They were the Deathworlders, humanity's secret weapon, created and forged in the most brutal environments the galaxy had ever seen. These were men and women who had survived on planets where nothing lived except the most hostile, dangerous creatures. Planets where the air was toxic, the terrain could kill you, and predators lurked around every corner. Life on these worlds was not just difficult, it was a constant battle for survival. Humanity had not chosen this path, but the Deathworlders were a product of the harshest survival instincts. They were born of worlds where the strongest survived and the weak perished. They had no choice but to become stronger, tougher, faster, and more lethal than any of their enemies. Over time, they had evolved into the ultimate warriors, unmatched by any alien species. These Deathworlders had never been used in combat, until now. They had been waiting for a moment when humanity would face extinction and have no other choice but to fight back. As the news of Iridium 9's fall spread throughout human space, the call went out. High Command activated the hidden forces. The Deathworlders were no longer just a secret. They were humanity's last hope. They were about to step onto a battlefield that was not their own, into a galaxy that saw them as little more than insignificant ants, not even worth the effort of squashing. One by one, the Deathworlders answered the call. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were survivors, each with a different story. Some had been born on the radioactive world of Trask, where the air was thick with toxic fumes, and only the toughest lived to see their 20th year. Others had spent their lives on Pharaoh 6, a planet where the ground itself was a minefield of deadly creatures, where each step could be your last. Some had lived on planets with volcanic activity that could melt a man to the bone in an instant. These were not ordinary humans. These were warriors whose only goal was to survive. And now, they would fight. They knew the Kylaxians were coming, and they knew they were the only ones who could stop them. The galaxy had no idea what was about to hit it. When the Kylaxians attacked, they had thought they were facing an easy victory. They had underestimated humanity in the worst possible way. As the Deathworlders assembled, their preparations were swift and efficient. There was no room for hesitation. They were born for this, raised for this. They had lived in constant danger their entire lives, and now they would turn that danger into their weapon. They loaded into their ships, their faces cold with determination. Every Deathworlder knew their mission. Every Deathworlder understood what was at stake. The Kylaxians had to be stopped. No mercy, no second chances. The fate of Iridium 9 and of humanity itself depended on them. In the command center, Sarah Griffin, the leader of the human resistance, watched as the Deathworlders prepared for their assault. She had seen the devastation Iridium 9 had suffered, and it had filled her with a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. She knew the Kylaxians would not stop at one colony. If they weren't stopped now, they would continue their campaign across human space, killing millions. Humanity had been at the mercy of the galaxy's powers for far too long. The Deathworlders were their chance to fight back, and Sarah had no intention of wasting it. "They're ready," her second-in-command, Colonel Hicks, said, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. "We'll have them deployed in a matter of hours." Sarah nodded. She didn't need words to express the weight of the moment. Her eyes were fixed on the monitor, where the fleet of Deathworlder ships was preparing to launch. She had heard the legends, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. These weren't the humans the Kylaxians had faced before. These were not the meek, submissive humans who had been content to hide under the shadows of the galaxy. No, these were the Deathworlders, and they would change the course of history. As the fleet took off, the quiet hum of the engines filled the room. The battle was about to begin. The Deathworlders had entered the battlefield, and with them, they brought the power of humanity's survival instinct. They would not be intimidated. They would not back down. The galaxy would soon learn what happens when humanity is pushed to the brink. The Kylaxians might have thought they had won, but they had only awoken a force that would make them regret ever crossing paths with humanity. The Deathworlders had arrived, and the killers, those who thought they could eliminate humanity with ease, were about to learn that humanity was not so easily defeated. The stage was set. The galaxy would never be the same again. The Kylaxians had never feared anything. They were predators, unmatched in combat, and they had conquered world after world with brutal efficiency. The galaxy trembled at the mention of their name, for the Kylaxians were the apex hunters, and their enemies were little more than prey. When they set their sights on Iridium 9, they expected the battle to be over before it even began. What they didn't know, however, was that their greatest mistake was underestimating the humans. As the Kylaxian fleet descended upon the human colony, they felt an odd sense of confidence, almost arrogance. Their warships, massive and fearsome, blotted out the sky above Iridium 9. The humans below, terrified and helpless, scrambled to defend their homes, but it was clear they stood no chance. The Kylaxian general smiled as they prepared for a swift victory, expecting nothing more than easy conquest. After all, humans had always been weak, insignificant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. They had no reason to think this time would be any different. But the Kylaxians did not know what was coming. Within hours of the attack, the first of the Deathworlders' ships entered the system. At first, the Kylaxians dismissed them as a minor nuisance, not worthy of attention. They believed these were just another human resistance force, no different from the many that had failed before. But as the ships moved closer to Iridium 9, the Kylaxians began to notice something unsettling. The humans aboard these ships were not like the others. They were different. They were prepared. The Deathworlder fleet was smaller than the Kylaxian armada, but it was a force of nature. The humans aboard these ships were not the usual soldiers or defenders. They were the Deathworlders, the survivors of the galaxy's harshest, most unforgiving planets. Each one was a master of combat, a warrior who had spent years adapting to environments so deadly that even the Kylaxians would falter. These humans were born of the most extreme worlds, planets where survival itself was a challenge. They were trained in the art of warfare not by choice, but by necessity. Sarah Griffin, now overseeing the operation from the command ship, watched as the Deathworlders engaged the Kylaxian forces. The Kylaxians, initially dismissive of the human threat, now found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. It was not just the ferocity of the Deathworlders. It was the way they fought, the way they adapted to every situation. The Kylaxians couldn't anticipate their moves, and that put them at a serious disadvantage. As the battle raged on, the Deathworlders hit the Kylaxian ships with precision and speed. Their tactics were brutal and efficient. There was no room for mercy in their minds. They targeted weak points in the Kylaxian fleet, exploiting every flaw in their defenses. Where the Kylaxians were slow to react, the Deathworlders moved like shadows, striking swiftly, and then disappearing into the chaos. One of the most dangerous of the Deathworlders, a man named Marcus Kane, led his squadron into the heart of the Kylaxian fleet. Marcus had been born on a planet where the seas were filled with deadly creatures, and the land was a jungle of predators, each more lethal than the last. There, he had learned to be fast, ruthless, and unforgiving. He had no room for hesitation. When the Kylaxian ships loomed before him, he didn't hesitate. His ship tore through the Kylaxian defenses, blasting through shields and hulls alike. His tactics were chaotic, unpredictable, and utterly terrifying. He was the storm that Kylaxians had never expected. Meanwhile, his comrades, equally deadly, were carving through the battlefield. They moved with an efficiency that made the Kylaxians' generals begin to question their arrogance. The humans were everywhere, on the ground, in the air, on the ships. There was no place the Kylaxians could hide. Their warriors were being picked off one by one, and their command ship, the heart of their invasion force, was beginning to crack under the relentless assault. The Kylaxians, at first too proud to consider retreat, now felt the first stirrings of fear. They were warriors, yes, but these humans, these Deathworlders, were something else. The Kylaxian generals quickly realized that they were not fighting an army of weaklings or civilians. These humans were trained to survive in the harshest conditions, and now they were using that experience to dismantle the Kylaxian war machine. But it wasn't just the tactics that unnerved the Kylaxians. It was the way the Deathworlders fought. They were relentless, like predators stalking their prey. They didn't tire. They didn't hesitate. They didn't stop. When a Kylaxian warship was disabled, the humans immediately moved in, capturing it, and using it against the enemy. Every Kylaxian defeat on the battlefield only seemed to fuel the humans' fury. There was no giving up. There was no retreat. The Kylaxians were not just losing the battle, they were being hunted. For the first time, the Kylaxians felt vulnerable. For the first time, they feared they might not win. As the battle wore on, the Kylaxians began to make a series of mistakes. Their communications were scrambled as the Deathworlders took out their command centers one by one. Their reinforcements were delayed as their fleet began to fall apart. The Kylaxian warriors, once fearless, now found themselves second-guessing their every move. They had underestimated the humans, and now they were paying the price. Back on the command ship, Sarah Griffin watched as the battle unfolded. It was everything she had hoped for. The Deathworlders were doing their job, pushing back the Kylaxian forces with an intensity that was almost too much to comprehend. But she also knew that this was only the beginning. The Kylaxians wouldn't back down so easily. They would regroup, they would counterattack. The Deathworlders might have struck the first blow, but the fight wasn't over yet. As she stared at the battlefield, Sarah felt a strange sense of pride. Humanity had been underestimated for so long, and now the galaxy was witnessing what they were truly capable of. The Deathworlders were proving that when humans are pushed to the brink, they will rise up and fight back with a ferocity unlike any other species. The Kylaxians might have been powerful, but humanity's will to survive was stronger. And with that, the tide of the battle had begun to shift. The Kylaxians were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. The galaxy would soon know that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. The smoke from the battlefield still floated in space. Kylaxian ships, once feared across the stars, now drifted as broken wrecks. Their hulls cracked open like eggshells. Fire and sparks flew from their command bridges. The Deathworlders had arrived, and everything had changed. At first, the galaxy had watched in silence, unsure of what was happening. Alien broadcasters hesitated to report it. The Kylaxians were supposed to be unbeatable. Entire civilizations had fallen to them in a matter of days. But now, Their elite strike fleet was falling apart. The ones who did survive had only one thing on their minds: escape. The fear started slowly. It began with whispers, small transmissions from fleeing Kylaxian scouts. "They don't fight like normal soldiers," one pilot said, his voice shaking. "They move too fast. They don't stop, even when you hit them," another voice interrupted. "They took out a destroyer, on foot." The Kylaxian High Command didn't believe the reports at first. They assumed it was a mistake, maybe a human trick, maybe bad intelligence. But the panic grew. More ships were lost. More commanders went silent. And then, the worst message came. The Deathworlders had taken over a Kylaxian command ship. It had been impossible to imagine. A single squad of human warriors had boarded the flagship Ravager's Mercy, and within minutes, the entire crew was dead or captured. The humans didn't ask for surrender. They didn't stop to rest. They moved through the halls like shadows, clearing room after room. Kylaxian guards fired at them, but they kept coming. The Deathworlders wore armor made from materials the Kylaxians didn't recognize, resistant to plasma, tough like living metal. And when their weapons ran out, the humans fought with their hands. Bones broke, claws shattered. Kylaxians were warriors, but the Deathworlders were monsters. The Kylaxians who escaped that ship were not warriors anymore. They were broken, terrified, and silent. In the War Council of the Kylaxian Empire, alarms were sounding. For the first time in centuries, they declared a retreat from a front line. This had never happened before. Not even when facing united fleets of alien species, but now a small force of humans, only a few thousand Deathworlders, was causing full-scale panic. Supreme Commander Vostar stood at the center of the war chamber, claws digging into the floor. His eyes flicked from screen to screen. His generals stood in silence, watching as their once perfect strategies failed in real time. "What are they?" one of his advisors whispered. "These humans. They're not like before." "They're not just humans," another added. "There's something else." Vostar growled. "They were born on death worlds. Planets not even our strongest can survive. It makes sense now. We thought Earth was bad. We were wrong. There are worse places, and they made soldiers from them. But why now?" Another asked. "Why didn't the humans use them before?" "They didn't need to," Vostar said, voice low, "until we pushed them too far." That was the truth. Humanity had held back. For centuries, they'd tried peace. They joined councils, made treaties, followed rules. But every time, the galaxy treated them like insects, until Iridium-9 burned. That colony wasn't just a home. It was a line that should never have been crossed. And now, the humans had answered, not with words, but with warriors. Across the galaxy, other species watched the chaos unfold. Broadcasts showed Deathworlders dropping from ships in zero armor, landing behind enemy lines, tearing through elite alien forces like paper. They weren't just strong, they were smart, tactical, focused. They studied their enemies and used every weakness. Kylaxian ships had thick armor, so Deathworlders used explosives to peel them open. Kylaxians fought in groups, so the humans split them apart, hunted them one by one. It wasn't a war. It was a purge. Some Kylaxian fleets refused to retreat. They still believed in their old strength. They charged into battle, roaring like monsters. But every time they did, the Deathworlders were waiting in silence like patient predators. There was one moment that shook the galaxy most. On the desert moon of Vaskra, a full Kylaxian battalion landed to secure a research station. Over 2,000 warriors, armed with heavy weapons. They laughed when they saw only a dozen humans guarding the base. 12 humans. The Kylaxian commander said, "This is not a fight. It is an insult." What he didn't know was that those 12 were all Deathworlders. 17 minutes later, the Kylaxian battalion was gone. not defeated, gone. The last security drone showed footage of the Deathworlders running through the sand, moving like shadows, silent and unstoppable. No one survived. No one even managed to send a final message. The galaxy couldn't deny it anymore. The Deathworlders had become the most feared force known to any species. Stories spread faster than light. They said Deathworlders didn't feel pain, that they could breathe poison and survive in space without suits, that their blood was fire and their bones were steel. Of course, those stories were exaggerations, but no one dared test them. The panic reached the outer colonies of the Kylaxian Empire. Civilians fled. Military officers deserted. Entire bases were abandoned, not because humans had attacked, but because they might. The fear was enough. The Deathworlders didn't need to conquer. Their name alone did the work. On Earth, Sarah Griffin watched the chaos unfold. In a dark room filled with screens, she stood in silence as alien news feeds showed worlds trembling at the mention of humanity. She didn't smile. There was no joy in this. "This wasn't what we wanted," she said quietly to General Hicks. "We wanted peace." "Yes," Hicks replied, watching another report of a Kylaxian fleet retreating. "But peace only works when others respect your strength." They never did. Now they do. The Deathworlders had changed everything. They weren't just warriors. They were a message, a warning. Humanity had been quiet for too long. The galaxy had poked the sleeping bear. Now the bear was awake and angry. The Kylaxians sent a message to the Human Alliance, begging for talks. They wanted to end the fighting, to return to the old rules, to go back to the way things were. But the humans didn't answer. At least not yet, because deep in the Deathworlder camps, more were training. New recruits from forgotten colonies, from the harsh planets no one ever visited. Humans who had never been given a chance to fight, now ready to prove themselves. And as the training camps filled, one message echoed again and again. "We're not the threat. We're the response." The Kylaxians had brought war to humanity's doorstep. Now humanity was bringing it back, to everyone. The battlefield had gone quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It was the kind that came after fear, after chaos, after death. Kylaxian warships floated in pieces across orbit, smoke drifting through space like ghosts of what once was. The Deathworlders didn't just fight. They dismantled an empire's pride, piece by piece. Commander Vostar stared at the tactical map inside the Kylaxian flagship Red Fang. The glowing display flickered from damage, but the truth was clear. The warfront had collapsed. Every red dot, each representing a Kylaxian fleet, was either blinking with distress or disappearing completely. He clenched his jaw. He had fought hundreds of battles across dozens of systems. He had turned rebel worlds to ash, brought entire moons to their knees. But this was something else. These humans had shattered their expectations. They had destroyed the image of a weak, emotional species. What Vostar saw now was something more dangerous, focused rage. And they had unleashed it with terrifying precision. He slammed his clawed hand on the console, ordered the retreat. His officers looked up in shock. "Retreat? Supreme Commander, you think I don't want to retreat?" Vostar barked. "But this is not war. This is a slaughter, and we're not the ones doing it anymore." He gave the order. It echoed across every surviving fleet. Retreat. Fall back. Escape. For the first time in centuries, the mighty Kylaxian war machine pulled away from battle, not from overwhelming numbers, but from fear, from humans, from Deathworlders. Across the galaxy, alien species watched in disbelief. The Kylaxians, who once stood tall and proud, who laughed in the face of enemy resistance, were now fleeing like hunted animals. Their ships limped through hyperspace lanes, battered and broken. Some didn't even make it back. Deathworlder raiders chased them through asteroid belts and ion storms, picking off survivors like wolves hunting the last deer. The Kylaxians tried to hide their shame, But news spread faster than hyperspace travel. Broadcasts leaked from their internal channels. Audio logs, footage, screams. They came out of nowhere. We didn't see them, just death. We shot one. He kept coming. We emptied our weapons, and he still walked forward. We begged for surrender. They didn't speak. They just stared. Fear wasn't spreading. It had already arrived. On one neutral station, a famous alien war analyst spoke into the camera, eyes wide and voice shaking. "What we are witnessing," he said, "is a shift in galactic history. Humans, once dismissed as diplomatic and soft, have shown their teeth, and they are sharp." Back on Earth, Sarah Griffin stood in the war room, surrounded by glowing screens. Reports poured in. Victory after victory. System after system being cleared of Kylaxian forces. "They're running," Colonel Hicks said, reading the latest updates. Some fleets didn't even fire back. They just jumped to light speed. Sarah didn't smile. Her eyes were tired, but sharp. "We warned them," she said. "They didn't listen." She turned toward the center of the room, where a large hologram of the galaxy rotated slowly. A third of it was now colored in human blue. Before the war, it had only been a thin stretch near Earth. Now it was expanding. Fast. But that wasn't the goal. Sarah pressed a button, pulling up the Kylaxian homeworld system. "They're falling back here," she said. "It's where they'll make their last stand. And they think we won't follow." Hicks raised an eyebrow. "Are we?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke with a calm certainty. "They made us bleed. They burned our people. They thought we were weak. We gave them every chance to stop. And they kept pushing." Her voice hardened. "Now we push back." Meanwhile, far from Earth, in the darkness of space, the Deathworlder fleet regrouped. Their ships were not massive like the Kylaxians. They weren't built for beauty or intimidation. They were efficient, brutal, and fast. Inside the ships, the warriors cleaned their weapons, patched their armor, and sat quietly. Deathworlders didn't celebrate. They prepared for the next fight. Marcus Kane sat in silence in the loading bay, his armor covered in scratches and dried black blood. Not his own. He looked up at the stars through a small window. A young recruit, no older than 20, sat beside him. Her name was Juno. She'd just returned from her first real mission. "They ran," she said, almost confused. "We didn't even have to finish the last squad. They dropped their weapons." Marcus didn't turn his head, because they finally understood. Understood what? He finally looked at her, his voice low. That they weren't the monsters anymore. We were. Juno didn't know how to feel about that. Should she be proud? Scared? Both. Marcus stood. "Get some rest. We move again soon." Back in the Kylaxian Empire, chaos reigned. Civil unrest broke out. For the first time in their history, colonies began to question the high command. Riots spread. Soldiers abandoned posts. Entire clans refused to send their youth to join the war. Some Kylaxians even called for peace. One of them, a general named Varkadal, broadcasted a message across multiple systems. "This war was started by our pride. We believed no one could challenge us. We were wrong. The humans did not become monsters. They became what we forced them to be. If we do not stop now, we will be erased from history." Vostar watched the message in disgust. "Cowards," he muttered. But deep down, even he knew it was already too late. The Deathworlders were not just coming for revenge. They were coming to make sure no one ever tried to hurt humanity again. Not the Kylaxians. Not anyone. And as the final defensive fleets were being pulled together around the Kylaxian homeworld, one terrifying truth echoed through every system, every mind, every council across the stars. The Deathworlders were not a secret anymore. They were the message. And the galaxy was listening. The stars above the Kylaxian homeworld burned brighter than ever before. Not because of natural light, but because of the fleet. A massive wall of human ships, led by the Deathworlders, now stood at the edge of the Kylaxian system, silent, unmoving, waiting. The message was clear. We are here. Inside the Kylaxian High Command Chamber, fear hung in the air like poison. Supreme Commander Vostar stood before a massive screen, showing the growing number of human vessels. Hundreds, thousands, not just Earth ships, but support from other human colonies. Even a few alien allies had joined, those who once feared the Kylaxians, but now saw a new power rising. They didn't stop, Vostar growled, his voice shaky. They came all the way. One advisor whispered, "This is not a war anymore. It's judgment." On the other side of the galaxy, in Earth's War Council room, Sarah Griffin stood tall, surrounded by admirals and diplomats. Her eyes were locked on the live feed of the fleet. "The time has come," she said calmly. "Not for revenge, not for destruction, but for truth." General Hicks nodded. "The galaxy is watching." And it was. All communication networks across systems were now tuned in. Civilizations across the stars paused their lives. Screens glowed in homes, marketplaces, temples. No one wanted to miss what would happen next, because this wasn't just about war anymore. This was a moment that would divide galactic history into before and after. A single human command ship began to move forward. It opened a channel. The voice was calm, but unshakable. "This is Commander Sarah Griffin of the United Human Front. We are not here to conquer. We are not here to destroy. But we will not be ignored." The Kylaxian High Command listened in stunned silence. "You attacked us. You burned our homes. You killed our children," she continued. "And when we begged for peace, you mocked us. You took our kindness for weakness. You saw us as small." Sarah paused. "But small things survive. Small things adapt. Small things fight harder when they have nothing left to lose." A second voice joined her transmission. "Marcus Kane, Deathworlder squad leader. You wanted war. Now it's at your front door. The choice is yours. Stand down, or we finish this." The message ended. Silence followed. No one moved. Then the unthinkable happened. The Kylaxian flagship opened a reply channel. Vostar himself appeared on screen. His proud eyes now held something new. Regret. "This war was never supposed to go this far," he said, voice lower than ever before. "But we made a mistake. We underestimated you." He took a slow breath. "And now, we surrender." Across the galaxy, a wave of shock rolled like thunder. Civilians screamed. Councils froze. The unbeatable empire had fallen. To humans, to Deathworlders. Vostar continued, "Let this message be heard. The Kylaxians yield. We call for peace, not because we are weak, but because we finally understand your strength." Sarah nodded slowly. "You don't need to fear us," she replied. "But never forget us." The human fleet stood down. No shots were fired. No cities bombed. No ships destroyed. The Deathworlders didn't move. They simply watched. They didn't come for blood. They came to show what happened when you push humanity too far. In the days that followed, everything changed. The Galactic Council reconvened. For years, humans had been treated like outsiders, given no real power. But now, the council chamber was quiet as Sarah Griffin entered. Even the gods of ancient races stood when she passed. No one dared speak over her. She didn't shout. She didn't boast. She simply said, "You saw what we're capable of. Now let's build something better." It wasn't just the Kylaxians who changed. Every species did. Treaties were rewritten. New rules formed. Humanity wasn't feared just for its weapons, but for its will, for its refusal to break, for its choice to end the war with restraint, not vengeance. The Deathworlders, their mission complete, returned to their hidden colonies. They were not interested in fame. They didn't join parades. They simply faded back into the shadows. But their legend remained. In taverns across star systems, soldiers whispered their names. They say one Deathworlder fought off 20 Kylaxians alone. Did you hear about the one who survived a reactor blast and walked out? My uncle swears he saw them move faster than a plasma shot. Not all the stories were true, but no one dared say that out loud. Back on Earth, Marcus Kane stood on a cliffside near his old training ground. He looked out over the ocean, waves crashing like the distant roar of battle. Juno stood beside him, now a seasoned warrior herself. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not the Kylaxians, but someone else will." "Then what do we do?" He looked at her and smiled faintly. "We wait, and we remember who we are." And far above them, among the stars, the galaxy slowly began to heal. But deep in the void, every species remembered one thing: never provoke the Deathworlders. Not because they are monsters, but because they are what you become when monsters come knocking, and you survive.